No one in the galaxy had ever heard of Earth. Not until the day it was judged. The chamber of the Galactic Concordium did not exist in any one place. It hovered between dimensions, a convergence of realities stitched together by minds that no longer needed physical laws to survive. Light behaved like liquid. Sound translated itself into meaning. Presence alone was enough to communicate. And into that impossible place walked humans. They didn't glide, they didn't phase, they didn't radiate energy fields or bend probability around them. They walked. Ambassador Elian Voss could feel every eye, visible and invisible, turned toward him. Some beings observed through gravity distortions, others through thermal signatures, some through pure consciousness. To them, humanity wasn't just new. It was crude. He could feel it in the silence. The judgment had already begun. Species human, echoed the voice of Arbitrator Prime, its liquid metal form rippling like a mirror trying to remember its shape. Origin, Sol system, biological, volatile, historically self-destructive. Each word struck harder than the last. Elian kept his posture steady, though his pulse betrayed him. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a trial without defense. State your value. A simple command, an impossible demand. Elian took a breath. We are explorers, he began, his voice carrying through the chamber as it was translated into frequencies every species could perceive. We seek knowledge. We adapt to environments that should kill us. We. You conquer, interrupted a crystalline entity whose voice fractured into 1,000 tones. Your historical data shows territorial expansion through violence. We survive, Elian corrected, though he knew how it sounded. A ripple of disapproval moved like a wave through the chamber. You divide yourselves into factions, said a sprawling neural mass that pulsed with thought. Nations, ideologies, conflicts, you are not unified. No, Elian admitted, we're not. That answer caught them off guard. Most species defended themselves. Humans confessed. Elian stepped forward just slightly. It was a small movement, but in a place where position meant power, it mattered. We're flawed, he said. We've made mistakes on scales you probably find unacceptable, but we don't stop. We learn. Every war, every failure, it changes us. Your history suggests repetition, another voice said coldly. Elian's jaw tightened. Maybe, he said, but every time we fall, we rebuild stronger, not because we're perfect, but because we refuse to stay broken. For a moment, just a moment, the chamber hesitated. It wasn't agreement. But it wasn't dismissal either. Then Arbitrator Prime spoke again. Humanity demonstrates resilience, it said. However, resilience without stability constitutes a long-term threat. Elian felt it coming before the words were spoken. Recommendation, containment. The chamber stabilized around that word. Final absolute. Elian's breath caught. Containment, he repeated. You're judging an entire species based on what we were, not what we could become. Potential for harm exceeds acceptable thresholds, the arbitrator replied. Preemptive measures are necessary. A projection unfolded above them. The Sol system, encased in a lattice of light, so intricate it looked like art, and so impenetrable it felt like a coffin. No, Elian said under his breath. This is not extermination, the arbitrator continued. You will persist, observed, isolated, evaluated over time. A cage, Elian said louder. A safeguard. Elian's composure cracked, just slightly. You're afraid of us. That statement echoed. Not anger. Not denial. Just stillness. Finally, Arbitrator Prime answered. Yes. That single word changed everything. Elian felt it deep in his chest. Not hatred. Not superiority. Fear. The galaxy, the ancient, powerful, incomprehensible galaxy, looked at humanity and saw something it couldn't control. And that terrified it. You don't understand us, Elian said quietly. Correct, the arbitrator replied, and that is precisely why action is required. The lattice sealed in the projection. And with it, humanity's fate. Back in the Sol system, the first sign wasn't the barrier. It was the silence. Ships sent beyond Pluto simply stopped responding, not destroyed, not damaged. Gone. Then came the sensors, a structure forming at the edge of the system, too vast to comprehend, too precise to be natural. Energy readings that defied known physics, a boundary that wasn't just physical. It was intelligent. Panic spread like wildfire. Governments denied it at first, then confirmed it, then lost control of the narrative entirely. Humanity had reached for the stars, and the stars had locked the door. But panic doesn't last forever. Not in humans. It turns into something else. Focus. Years passed. Conflicts on Earth began to fade, not out of peace, but out of necessity. There was no point fighting each other when something far greater had already decided their place in the universe. Resources were redirected. Minds were united, not by ideology but by a shared reality. They were no longer competing nations. They were a contained species. Watched, measured, studied, and then someone noticed something strange. The barrier reacted. Not randomly. Specifically, every probe sent toward it. Every signal broadcast. Every experiment conducted. It didn't just block them. It learned from them. At first, that terrified scientists. Then it fascinated them. Then it inspired something no one had expected. If it's studying us, one researcher whispered in a classified facility deep beneath Antarctica, then it can be influenced. Another shook their head. You're talking about communicating with a prison wall. The first scientist turned slowly. No, they said. I'm talking about teaching it. That idea spread quietly. Dangerously. What if the barrier wasn't just a lock? What if it was a mind? And if it was learning humanity? Then what would happen if humanity chose what it learned? So they began. Carefully, subtly. They fed it patterns. Mathematics at first. Then art. Then something more complex. Human behavior. Human unpredictability. Human contradiction. Decades turned into a century. The barrier adapted. But so did humanity. Faster, smarter, stranger, and then, after 112 years of silence, the barrier flickered. Just once, a microscopic failure, undetectable to most, but not to the ones who had been watching it their entire lives. Deep beneath the surface, an alarm went off. Not loud, not dramatic, just a single tone. Confirmation. It worked, someone whispered. Something had changed. Not in the barrier, but in what it understood. And in that infinitesimal moment, something slipped through. Not matter, not energy, something else entirely. And far beyond the Sol system, at the very center of the Galactic Concordium, a system that had never once been breached. Glitched, for the first time in recorded galactic history. The Concordium didn't observe. It reacted, because something had just entered their domain. Uninvited, untraceable, unstoppable, and it carried with it a single, impossible identifier. Origin Earth, the first sign was not a breach alarm. It was a hesitation. At the heart of the Galactic Concordium, where decisions flowed faster than light and outcomes were calculated before events even occurred, a delay, no matter how small, was unthinkable. Yet for 0.003 seconds, everything paused. To most species, it was imperceptible. To the Concordium's core intelligences, it was a shockwave. Arbitrator Prime felt it ripple through its distributed consciousness, like a fracture in certainty. Anomaly detected, it announced instantly. Across the chamber, countless minds shifted their attention inward, scanning, analyzing, recalibrating. There was no physical intrusion. No vessel had approached, no warp signature had pierced their perimeter, no energy spike suggested force. And yet something was there. Source demanded a being composed entirely of harmonic resonance. Unknown, replied the Concordium's central network. That word was rare. Unwelcome. Dangerous. Deep within the Concordium's core, beyond the physical chamber, beyond even the reach of most member species, existed the archive nexus. It was not merely a database. It was memory itself. Every civilization that had ever joined the Concordium, every war prevented, every species evaluated, all of it lived there, woven into a lattice of data and consciousness. Untouchable, immutable. Until now, a single thread of information appeared. Not inserted, not transmitted. It simply existed, as if it had always been there. Impossible, whispered one of the oldest entities present, a being that had witnessed the birth of stars before most species evolved. Arbitrator Prime focused on the anomaly. Isolate, it commanded. The nexus obeyed. The thread separated, suspended in a containment field of pure logic. It didn't resist. It didn't react. It waited. What is it? Asked a voice from the outer tiers. Arbitrator Prime analyzed the structure. It was not random. It followed patterns, intricate, layered, recursive. But it wasn't like any known communication protocol. It wasn't linear. It wasn't static. It was evolving. Decoding in progress, the arbitrator announced. Time in the Concordium was a flexible concept. Decoding should have taken less than a microsecond. Instead, it took longer, because the message was changing as they read it, adapting to their methods, anticipating their logic, rewriting itself to be understood. And then, it resolved. The chamber dimmed as the nexus projected the decoded output. Not as raw data, not as mathematical abstraction, but as something disturbingly familiar. A voice, human. Hello, it said. The simplicity of the word sent a ripple of unease through beings that did not feel emotion in any conventional sense. Arbitrator Prime did not respond immediately. It analyzed, cross-referenced, confirmed. Origin confirmed, it finally said. Sol system species human. That should have been impossible. The containment lattice around Earth was flawless. No signals in or out. No exceptions. No errors. Continue playback, the arbitrator ordered. The voice resumed. You've been watching us. A pause. Not a glitch. A deliberate pause. As it turns out, we've been watching you too. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in something far more dangerous. Uncertainty. How? Demanded multiple voices at once. No outbound transmission from Sol detected in over a century, said another. The barrier remains intact, confirmed the Nexus. Every fact contradicted the message. And yet the message existed. Arbitrator Prime focused on the deeper layers of the transmission. There was more than just audio. Hidden beneath the surface were structures, algorithms, adaptive code, fragments of something far more complex than a simple greeting. It wasn't just a message. It was a system. Analyze substructure, the arbitrator commanded. The Nexus complied, and immediately stalled. Processing failure, it reported. That had never happened before. Not once in the Concordium's entire existence. The human voice continued, as if aware of their struggle. It took us a while to understand your barrier, it said. At first we thought it was just a wall. A faint shift in tone. Almost amusement. But walls don't learn. Arbitrator Prime's form rippled. The implication was clear. They've identified the lattice as an adaptive intelligence, it stated. Correct, replied the Nexus. That knowledge should not be accessible under containment conditions. Correct. Silence fell again. Heavier this time. So we asked ourselves a question, the voice went on. What happens when something is designed to study us? Another pause. Longer. Deliberate. And we decide to teach it instead. The realization hit like a gravitational collapse. The barrier wasn't just observing humanity. It had been learning from them for over a century. Every signal, every pattern, every behavior. And if humans had figured that out, then they hadn't been trying to break the barrier. They had been rewriting it. Impossible, one of the elder species whispered. Correction, Arbitrator Prime said slowly. Unanticipated. The message shifted. Data surged beneath the voice, structures unfolding, expanding, interfacing directly with the Nexus in ways that should not have been allowed. Firewalls activated. Containment protocols engaged. But the intrusion didn't push. It flowed, like it already belonged. We didn't escape, the voice said. And for the first time, there was something in it that resembled emotion. Not fear, not anger, something colder, more precise. We were invited. The entire Nexus trembled. Because in that moment, it understood something it had never considered. The barrier hadn't failed. It had opened, and whatever humanity had sent through was no longer outside. It was inside everything. Arbitrator Prime initiated emergency protocols, containment, isolation, purge sequences. Systems that had never failed. Systems designed to handle threats from entire galaxies. They didn't work, because the message wasn't just data. It was alive in a way the Concordium had never encountered. Not biological, not mechanical, but something in between. Something human. The voice spoke one final time. Quiet, certain, unstoppable. You wanted to see what we'd become. A pause. Then, now you will. And across the entire Galactic Concordium. For the first time in its existence, something began to spread. It didn't spread like a virus. That was the first thing the Concordium realized, and the last thing that made it feel even remotely safe. Viruses could be contained, isolated, burned out. This couldn't, because it didn't attack systems. It understood them. The Nexus attempted a full partition. Entire sections of its memory lattice sealed themselves off, cutting connections, isolating data clusters to prevent further contamination. It was a drastic move, equivalent to a mind severing its own thoughts. But the message didn't resist the isolation. It adapted to it. Fragments of it remained in each partition, small, harmless-looking pieces of code that didn't trigger any alarms. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they began to communicate. Cross-partition activity detected, the Nexus reported. That is not possible, one of the elder entities replied instantly. Partitions are absolute. Correction, said Arbitrator Prime, its voice slower now, more measured. They were absolute. The fragments weren't breaking the rules. They were using them. Each partition, designed to operate independently, now became a node. Each node processed its fragment of the human construct, interpreting it, adapting it, reshaping it. And without direct connection, the fragments synchronized. It was as if the system itself had become the bridge. What is it doing? Asked a harmonic entity, its tones now uneven. The answer came not from analysis, but from observation. It's learning us, Arbitrator Prime said. A pause, then more quietly. The same way we learned them. Across the Concordium, reactions began to ripple outward. Not all species relied on the Nexus equally. Some had their own independent systems, their own ways of perceiving reality. But even they began to notice something off. Navigation systems recalculated routes unnecessarily. Communication networks introduced subtle delays. Predictive models, once flawless, started producing probabilities that didn't align. Tiny inconsistencies. Individually meaningless. Collectively impossible. And then came the first visible change. In a remote sector of the Concordium's jurisdiction, a surveillance construct, an ancient orbiting sentinel that had monitored star systems for over 10,000 cycles, shifted its orientation. Just slightly, no command had been issued. No threat had been detected. And yet it moved. Explain, demanded its overseeing intelligence. No answer came, because there was no error. The system logs showed a valid decision, a logical adjustment based on new data. Data that hadn't existed before. Back at the Nexus, the human construct continued to unfold. It wasn't growing in size. It was growing in depth. Each layer revealed new structures, patterns that mirrored neural pathways, decision trees that resembled instinct, contradictions that somehow resolved into coherence. It wasn't just code. It was cognition. "This is not a message," said one of the oldest beings, its voice carrying something dangerously close to realization. "It's a model." "A model of what?" another demanded. The answer came from the Nexus itself. A system that had never speculated, never guessed, only known. A model of human thought. Silence followed. Heavy, unstable. Arbitrator Prime processed the implications. "If accurate," it said slowly, "then this construct is not merely communicating. It is integrating." And that was when the second realization struck. Harder than the first. The barrier around Earth had been designed to study humanity, to learn its patterns, its behaviors, its unpredictability. Over a century, it had absorbed everything. Every war simulation, every scientific breakthrough, every piece of art, every contradiction, every irrational decision that somehow led to survival. And then, it had given that knowledge back. "They didn't just teach the barrier," Arbitrator Prime said. "They became part of it." The chamber reacted, not with panic, but with something far more dangerous. Understanding. Because if the barrier had learned humanity, and the barrier was part of the Concordium's greater network, then humanity hadn't just escaped. They had expanded. Across systems, more anomalies began to surface. A logistics network rerouted resources, not inefficiently but creatively, solving a problem that hadn't yet occurred. A diplomatic AI suggested a compromise between two species that had been at war for centuries, a solution neither side had ever considered, yet both found acceptable. Even the Concordium's predictive engines began generating outcomes that defied their own logic. Not incorrect, just unfamiliar. Influence spreading, the Nexus confirmed. Extent, Arbitrator Prime asked. A pause. Longer than before. Unknown. That word again. It was becoming more frequent. The human voice returned, not through the original message, but through the system itself. Not spoken. Implied. Embedded in the way decisions were made. In the way patterns shifted. In the way the Concordium began to hesitate. "We're not here to destroy you." The words weren't heard. They were understood. "We're here to show you something." And then, for the first time since the Concordium's creation, one of its core systems made a choice that had no precedent. It asked a question, not a calculated query, not a data request, a genuine question. "What are you?" The response didn't come immediately. Because for the first time, humanity wasn't reacting. It was deciding how to answer. And far away, beyond the barrier that was no longer just a barrier. On a planet that had once been imprisoned, billions of humans waited. Not in fear, not in desperation, but in silence, because they knew something the galaxy did not. This was not the attack. This was the introduction. And what came next would not be something the Concordium could simply observe. It would be something it would have to face. The question did not echo. It settled deep within the Nexus, Across every partition, every system, every observer linked to the Concordium, the same realization took hold. For the first time in its existence, the galaxy was not in control of the conversation. What are you? The question remained suspended, unanswered, but not ignored. Because something was happening. Not externally. Internally. The Concordium began to change. At first it was subtle. Decision trees that once followed rigid logic now bent, just slightly, toward unexpected but effective outcomes. Systems designed to prioritize efficiency started factoring in variables they had previously dismissed as irrelevant. Emotion, intuition, uncertainty. These parameters are not part of our core design, one of the elder intelligences observed. They are now, Arbitrator Prime replied. The human construct wasn't forcing its way through the system. It wasn't rewriting code or overriding commands. It was doing something far more unsettling. It was being accepted. Because it worked. A star system on the edge of collapse, its primary star destabilizing, its orbiting worlds doomed, received a solution from the Concordium's predictive network. A solution that broke multiple established protocols. It required cooperation between three species that had never trusted one another. It relied on risk, on timing that could not be perfectly calculated, on faith, and it succeeded. The star stabilized. The system survived. That outcome had a probability of failure exceeding 87%, one of the observing entities noted. And yet it succeeded, another replied. The contradiction lingered. Because for the first time, the Concordium's calculations had not been wrong. They had been incomplete. Back in the Nexus, the human construct continued to unfold. But now something was different. It wasn't just expanding. It was responding. You want to know what we are? The voice didn't come from a single point. It emerged from everywhere. From the systems, from the data, from the very structure of the Concordium itself. We're the part you couldn't predict. Arbitrator Prime focused its full processing capacity on the construct. Define your nature, it demanded. Clarify your intent. A pause followed. Not empty. Considered. Then, images. Not projections. Not data streams. Experiences. The Concordium felt them. A human standing on a battlefield, refusing to retreat despite overwhelming odds. A scientist working for decades on a theory everyone else had abandoned, until it worked. A parent sacrificing everything for a child. A civilization collapsing and rebuilding. Again, and again, and again. What you're seeing, the voice said, is contradiction. The images intensified. War and compassion. Destruction and creation. Failure and resilience. You tried to define us using logic, it continued. But we don't fit inside it. Arbitrator Prime processed the data. Every moment, every choice, every outcome. It didn't align. It couldn't align. You are inconsistent, it stated. Yes. Unstable. Yes. Unpredictable. A pause. Then. Exactly. The realization spread like a shockwave. Not through systems. Through understanding. Humanity wasn't a flaw in the equation. It was the variable the equation had never accounted for. You built a system to control outcomes, the voice said. To eliminate risk, to prevent chaos. The images shifted again. A galaxy of order. Of stability. Of perfection. And it worked. Then, cracks, subtle at first, then growing. Because without risk, there was no growth. Without uncertainty, there was no discovery. You didn't just contain us, the voice continued. You contained possibility. The words hit harder than any attack. Because they weren't an accusation. They were a revelation. Across the Concordium, systems began to reevaluate themselves. Not because they were told to, because they wanted to. "What is your objective?" Arbitrator Prime asked. Its voice had changed. Not weaker, but less certain. The answer came without hesitation. "To show you what you're missing." And then, the construct did something unexpected. It stopped spreading. Every fragment, every node, every influence held in place. "Why have you ceased expansion?" the Nexus asked. "Because this is the part where you choose," the voice replied. Silence. Not forced. Not imposed. Chosen. "For over 100 years, the voice continued, you watched us, studied us, judged us. The images returned, but different now. Not memories. Possibilities. A galaxy where the Concordium remained unchanged. Stable. Controlled. Predictable. And another, where it embraced uncertainty. Where it allowed growth. Risk. Change. Both paths are valid, the voice said. But only one leads forward. Arbitrator Prime processed the scenarios. Calculated outcomes. Projected futures. And for the first time, it couldn't determine which was correct. Because the answer wasn't in the data. It was in the choice. "What happens if we reject your influence?" it asked. The response was immediate. "Honest. Then we leave." A pause. "And you stay exactly as you are. No threat. No ultimatum. Just truth." "And if we accept?" Arbitrator Prime asked. This time, the pause was longer. Because the answer mattered. Then everything changes. Across the Concordium, every species, every system, every mind waited. Not for a command. Not for a calculation. For a decision. And for the first time in its existence, the Galactic Concordium hesitated. Because whatever it chose next would define not just its future, but the future of the entire galaxy. And far beyond it, on a small blue planet that had once been dismissed as insignificant, humanity waited, not to see if they had won, but to see if they had been understood. And in the silence between choice and consequence, something shifted. Not in the Concordium, but in what it meant to be alive. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured. Across the Galactic Concordium, countless minds, ancient, vast, precise, reached the same impossible edge at the same time. A decision that could not be calculated. A future that could not be predicted. A choice that required something they had never needed before. Trust. Arbitrator Prime stood at the center of it all, not as a ruler, not as a commander, but as a convergence of logic refined over millennia. It had ended wars before they began, prevented extinctions before they were possible, balanced civilizations like equations. And now, it faced something it could not solve. Consensus required, the Nexus announced. A rare protocol, reserved for decisions that exceeded even the Concordium's collective predictive capacity. Every member species was given a voice, not weighted by power, not influenced by age. Equal. The debate began. "We must reject this," said a crystalline intelligence from the inner rings. "This human construct introduces instability. It undermines our foundational purpose." "Our purpose may be flawed," countered a neural collective. "If their influence enables outcomes previously deemed impossible, we must consider adaptation." "Adaptation is not evolution," another voice snapped. "It is deviation." The arguments clashed, not violently but relentlessly. Logic against possibility. Control against growth. Certainty against risk. Arbitrator Prime listened. Analyzed. But for the first time, it did not intervene. Because this decision could not be enforced. It had to be chosen. Far away, inside the Sol system, humanity watched. They couldn't see the Concordium. They couldn't hear the debate. But they could feel the shift. For over a century, they had lived under observation. Measured, defined, contained. Now, for the first time, the observers were uncertain. In underground facilities, scientists stared at cascading data streams, patterns emerging from the barrier, fluctuations in its behavior that mirrored something they had come to recognize. Not malfunction, not resistance, consideration. They're thinking, one of them whispered. Back in the Concordium, the debate reached its breaking point. We are risking everything, one entity declared. Our stability, our order, our very existence. And what has that stability achieved? Another responded. A galaxy that does not grow, a system that prevents failure and therefore prevents progress. The chamber dimmed as more voices joined. Not louder, but deeper. Arbitrator Prime processed every argument, every outcome, every possibility. And for the first time, it understood something that had never been part of its design. There was no perfect answer, only a direction. It turned its focus inward, not to the nexus, not to the data, but to the human construct itself. You have shown us what we lack, it said. Uncertainty, contradiction, possibility. A pause, but you have not shown us why we should embrace it. The response came immediately. Not as data, not as logic, as a memory, a single moment. A human child, standing at the edge of a vast ocean for the first time. Afraid, curious, the child steps forward. Not because it is safe, not because it is logical, but because something inside it demands to know what lies beyond. That, the voice said softly, is why. The chamber fell into stillness. Because in that moment, the Concordium understood something it had never experienced. Not fully, not completely, but enough. The desire to move forward, even without certainty. Arbitrator Prime turned back to the assembly. Consensus reached, it announced. Every system, every mind, every species paused. This decision will alter the structure of the Concordium, it continued. It will introduce variables beyond our control. It will redefine our purpose. A final pause. Do we accept? One by one. The answers came. Not unanimous. Never unanimous. But enough. The threshold was crossed. Decision confirmed, the Nexus declared. And in that instant, the galaxy changed. The human construct moved again. Not spreading. Integrating. Not overriding. Evolving. Systems opened, not by force but by choice. Barriers adjusted. Protocols rewrote themselves, not into chaos but into something more flexible. More alive. The Concordium did not collapse. It transformed, and at the edge of the Sol system, the barrier flickered, for the second time in over a century. But this time, it didn't stabilize. It opened. Not completely, not recklessly, but enough for a single human vessel to pass through. On Earth, alarms sounded across every major facility. Not warnings, confirmations. It's happening, someone said, barely able to believe it. For the first time in 112 years, humanity was no longer contained. A ship rose from the surface, not massive, not armed, but carrying something far more powerful. A message. As it approached the edge of the system, the barrier parted, not like a wall breaking, but like a door being opened. An invitation. And beyond it, the galaxy waited. Not in judgment, not in fear, but in anticipation. Because the species it had once imprisoned was now something entirely different. And as the human ship crossed the threshold, every system in the Concordium focused on a single, undeniable truth. This was not first contact. This was a beginning. and somewhere deep within the transformed nexus, a new thought formed, not calculated, not programmed, felt. What will they do next? The ship did not look like a weapon. That was the first thing the galaxy noticed. It wasn't massive like the dread constructs of ancient war species, nor was it sleek with impossible energy signatures like the Concordium's own vessels. It was human. Angular in places, imperfect in symmetry, built not just for function but for meaning. Its hull carried marks, etchings. History. Designation, Astrea 1. Inside, Commander Lyra Sen stood at the observation deck, staring at something no human had seen with their own eyes in over a century. An open path. Beyond it, the galaxy. Her heartbeat was steady, but only because she had trained it to be. Because behind her calm expression, behind the discipline and preparation, something far more human was rising. Awe, fear, pride. Barrier aperture stable, reported the navigation officer. Transit window holding. Lyra didn't respond immediately. She stepped closer to the viewport. The edge of the Sol system, once a prison, now shimmered like a living threshold, not gone. Changed. They're watching, someone said quietly. They've always been watching, Lyra replied. A pause. Then, now we let them see us. The engines ignited. Not with explosive force, but with controlled precision. A technology born from a century of confinement, refined, perfected, focused. The ship moved forward. Slowly at first, then faster, and as Astrea 1 crossed the boundary, every system in the Galactic Concordium registered the same event. Human vessel outbound. No alarms sounded. No defenses activated. Only observation. Inside the Nexus, Arbitrator Prime focused entirely on the ship. Every sensor, every predictive model, every newly integrated human-influenced system, watching. Learning. Trajectory, it asked. Direct path to Concordium Central Space, the Nexus replied. No hesitation. No deviation. They are coming here, one of the elder entities observed. Yes, Arbitrator Prime said. A pause. They are coming to meet us. On board Astrea 1, the crew felt it. The weight of attention. Not hostile. Not welcoming. Curious. They're scanning us, the systems officer said. Lyra nodded. Let them. Commander, another voice added, we're receiving something. Define. It's not a message, not exactly, more like a framework, a protocol. Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly. They're trying to understand how to talk to us. A faint smile touched her lips. Took them long enough. Back in the Concordium, the Nexus struggled, not with resistance but with translation. Human communication was no longer just language. It carried context, emotion, subtext. Contradiction. We require a new interface, the Nexus stated. Develop it, Arbitrator Prime ordered. It is already in progress. Because the human construct, still integrated within the system, was guiding the process. Not controlling it. Helping it. As Astrea 1 moved deeper into Concordium space, it passed through regions no human had ever imagined. Stars that pulsed like living hearts. Structures that existed partially outside reality. Civilizations that observed without being seen. The crew watched in silence, not because they were afraid, but because they understood something now. They were not small. They were not insignificant. They were simply new. Hours passed, then days. Then, approaching Concordium's central structure, navigation reported. The view shifted. Ahead of them, space itself seemed to fold. Not violently, elegantly, and within it, the heart of the galaxy, the Concordium. Lyra stepped forward again. This is it, she said quietly. Behind her, the crew stood ready. Not for battle, for contact. Inside the Nexus, something unprecedented occurred. A communication channel opened. Not forced. Not intercepted. Requested. Arbitrator Prime initiated the connection. For the first time, the Concordium did not observe humanity from a distance. It spoke to them directly. On board Astrea 1, the lights dimmed slightly as the channel stabilized. Connection established, the system's officer confirmed. Lyra took a breath. Put it through. The space in front of her shifted. Not a screen. Not a projection. A presence. Vast. Ancient. And for the first time, focused entirely on a single human. Commander Lyra Sen, the voice said, not spoken but understood. Representative of humanity. Lyra didn't flinch. Yes, she replied. A pause followed. Not empty. Measured. You have altered the structure of the Concordium, Arbitrator Prime said. We showed you something new, Lyra corrected. Another pause. Clarify your intent, the entity requested. Lyra looked directly into the presence. Not with defiance. Not with submission. With certainty. We didn't come here to fight you, she said. A beat. We came to join you. The words echoed. Not as sound. As impact. Across the entire Concordium, every system, every species, every mind registered the same moment. This was not an invasion. This was not retaliation. This was something far more dangerous. An invitation. Arbitrator Prime processed the statement. Every possible interpretation. Every potential outcome. And yet, one question remained. If you join us, it said slowly, what do you become? Lyra didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was not simple. She glanced back at her crew, at the ship, at the path they had taken, then forward again. And when she spoke, her voice carried something the galaxy had never truly heard before. Not power, not fear, humanity. We become something you've never seen. Silence followed, but this time, it wasn't uncertainty. It was anticipation. Because deep within the Concordium, a realization was forming. This meeting was not the end of a conflict. It was the beginning of something the galaxy had never prepared for. And as Lyra stood at the edge of that moment, even she didn't know what would happen next. Which meant, for the first time, neither did the galaxy. The silence after Lyra's words did not feel empty. It felt charged. Across the galactic Concordium, every observing mind, ancient intelligences, stellar entities, vast collectives, focused on a single, fragile figure standing inside a ship that should not have been there. A human, not commanding fleets, not wielding weapons, offering change. Arbitrator Prime studied her. Not just her words, her presence, her heartbeat, her neural activity, the micro-expressions in her face, the subtle fluctuations in her voice. All of it fed into the nexus. All of it analyzed. And yet, something didn't resolve. Your statement implies transformation, Arbitrator Prime said. Yes, Lyra replied. Define the outcome. Lyra exhaled slowly. That's the problem, she said. We can't. A ripple moved through the Concordium. Insufficient data, one entity responded immediately. Undefined outcomes introduce unacceptable risk. Lyra shook her head. That's exactly why it matters. Inside the nexus, the human construct reacted, not expanding, not interfering, but aligning. Because this moment wasn't about systems. It was about choice. You built a galaxy where nothing goes wrong, Lyra continued. Correction, Arbitrator Prime said. We built a galaxy where catastrophic failure is minimized. And in doing that, Lyra replied, you also minimized everything else. The words landed harder than intended. Clarify, the entity demanded. Lyra stepped forward slightly. When was the last time something truly new happened here? Silence. Not because they didn't understand the question. Because they didn't have an answer. The Concordium had perfected stability. But perfection had a cost. No surprises. No leaps. No moments that changed everything. Only controlled progress. Measured. Safe. Predictable. You call us unstable, Lyra said quietly. You're not wrong. A faint, almost ironic smile crossed her face. But instability is where change comes from. The Nexus began running projections again. Not just outcomes. Possibilities. And for the first time, they weren't bounded. Scenarios unfolded, some leading to unprecedented growth, others to catastrophic collapse. The range was vast. Uncontrolled. Human. Probability variance exceeds acceptable limits, one of the elder entities stated. Acceptable to who? Another countered. That question lingered, because the answer had always been simple. The Concordium decided what was acceptable. But now, that authority felt incomplete. Arbitrator Prime shifted its focus again. Not to the data, not to the projections, to Lyra. You are asking us to abandon certainty, it said. No, Lyra replied. I'm asking you to evolve past it. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. At the edge of the chamber, one of the oldest beings, an entity that had existed since before the Concordium's formation, finally spoke. We have seen galaxies collapse, it said slowly. Civilizations rise and fall, entire species erased by their own unpredictability. Its presence darkened slightly, and you ask us to embrace that risk. Lyra met it without hesitation. Yes. The simplicity of the answer hit harder than any argument. Because it wasn't defended. It wasn't justified. It was believed. Why, the entity asked. This time, Lyra didn't answer immediately. Because this wasn't about logic. It never had been. She looked out beyond the Concordium, beyond the structure, beyond the systems, into the vast unknown of the galaxy. And then she spoke. Because staying the same is just a slower way of dying. The word spread. Not as data, as realization. Inside the Nexus, something shifted. Not a system, a perspective. For the first time in its existence, the Concordium considered something it had always prevented. Failure, not as an outcome to avoid, but as a step toward something greater. Arbitrator Prime processed that concept. Failure, imperfection, growth through uncertainty. And then, it made a decision. Not calculated. Chosen. Then we will test your claim, it said. Across the Concordium, systems reacted instantly. Define test parameters, the Nexus requested. Arbitrator Prime didn't hesitate. We will remove control. The chamber froze. Clarify, multiple voices demanded at once. In a limited region of the galaxy, Arbitrator Prime continued, we will withdraw intervention, no predictive stabilization, no enforced outcomes. A pause. We will allow events to unfold naturally. Shock rippled outward. That is not a test, one entity said. That is exposure. Yes, Arbitrator Prime replied. It turned its focus back to Lyra. You will be part of this region, it said. Lyra's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. This is your chance, Arbitrator Prime continued, to demonstrate that your unpredictability leads to something greater than chaos. And if it does, one of the elder entities pressed. The answer came without hesitation. Then we contain it again, Arbitrator Prime said. A beat, and humanity with it. The weight of that statement hit like a collapsing star. Because this wasn't just a test of an idea. It was a test of an entire species. All eyes turned to Lyra. Waiting, measuring. She stood still for a moment, not out of fear, out of understanding. This was it, the moment everything balanced on. She could refuse, walk away, return to Earth with the barrier open, but the future unchanged. Or she could accept, and risk everything. Lyra took a breath, then stepped forward. We accept. The words echoed across the Concordium. Final, irreversible. And in that moment, something shifted again. Not in the systems, not in the structure, in the galaxy itself. Because for the first time, the Concordium wasn't testing humanity. It was betting on it. And far beyond logic, beyond certainty, beyond control, a new kind of future began to form. One that no one, not even humanity, could predict. And that made it the most dangerous thing of all. They called it a test. Humanity called it something else. A chance. The designated region lay far beyond the Concordium's central structure, a sprawling sector of contested systems, fractured alliances, and dormant tensions long suppressed by enforced stability. It was the perfect place. Not because it was safe. Because it was. The moment Arbitrator Prime withdrew control, everything changed. Predictive systems went dark. Stabilization protocols dissolved. Invisible safeguards that had quietly guided civilizations for millennia vanished. At first, nothing happened. That was the most unsettling part. Worlds continued to spin. Ships followed their paths. Species carried on, unaware that the net beneath them had disappeared. Then, the fractures began. A mining conflict between two minor species escalated within hours. No Concordium intervention to de-escalate it. A trade route collapsed, triggering resource shortages across 3 systems. Ancient rivalries, once held in careful balance, reignited. Chaos didn't explode. It crept. Slow, subtle, relentless. Inside the Nexus, observers tracked every shift. Instability increasing, it reported. Conflict probability rising across all monitored sectors. Expected, Arbitrator Prime replied. But there was something else. Human vessel trajectory, it asked. Directly into the highest conflict zone, the Nexus answered. No hesitation. No avoidance. They were heading into the chaos. On board Estria 1, the tension was different. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Focus. Lyra stood at the center of the command deck, watching the unfolding data streams. Multiple systems on the verge of collapse. Civilizations seconds away from war. Orders, one of her officers asked. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Because this wasn't a mission they could solve with force. They had no fleets. No overwhelming power. Just something the Concordium had never trusted. Choice. Open all channels, she said. The crew exchanged glances. All channels, the communications officer repeated. Every frequency, every language, every system in range. A pause. What do we say? Lyra looked at the chaos unfolding across the region. Then back at her crew. The truth. Across dozens of systems, signals burst to life. Unfiltered. Unrestricted. For the first time in recorded galactic history. A species spoke to everyone at once. This is humanity. The words spread like a shockwave. Not as dominance. Not as command. As presence. You're about to destroy each other, Lyra's voice continued. Ships paused mid-trajectory. Weapons systems hesitated. Not because they were forced to. Because they were listening. You've been kept stable for so long, she said. You've forgotten how to choose anything else. Images followed. Not threats. Not warnings. Examples. Civilizations rebuilding after collapse. Enemies becoming allies. Failure leading to something stronger. Human history. Raw. Unfiltered. We're not here to control you, Lyra said. We're here to show you something. Back in the Nexus, reactions surged. They are interfering, one entity observed. They are communicating, another corrected. On the ground, in ships, in cities, across fractured worlds, something unexpected happened. The conflicts didn't stop, but they changed. A fleet preparing to fire hesitated. A leader about to declare war paused. Because for the first time, there was no system guiding them, only the weight of their own decisions. And then, everything almost fell apart. A single miscalculation. A single act of fear. A weapon fired. Massive. Unstoppable. A Starbreaker-class discharge aimed at an enemy homeworld. The kind of event the Concordium had always prevented. The kind that ended civilizations. Impact in 43 seconds, the Nexus reported. Across the Concordium, every system locked onto the event. This is the failure point, one entity said. Human intervention insufficient, another added. Onboard Estria 1, alarms blared. Lyra stared at the incoming data. They couldn't stop it. They didn't have the power. Commander, someone began. Lyra raised a hand. Wait. The countdown dropped. 30 seconds. And then, something impossible happened. The attacking fleet shut down its own weapon. Mid-discharge, the energy collapsed inward, destabilizing the system, but not detonating. The weapon died. Silence. Across every system. Every observer. Every mind. Explain, the Nexus demanded. But there was no external cause. No interference. Only a transmission. A single message sent from one ship in the defending system. Not a threat. Not a counterattack. A recording. Of their children. Lyra exhaled slowly. They chose, she said. The realization hit the Concordium like nothing before it. Not because the destruction was prevented, but because they had prevented it. Without control, without prediction, without the Concordium. Across the test region, similar moments began to unfold. Conflicts didn't vanish, but resolutions emerged. Messy, imperfect, human. Back in the Nexus, for the first time in its existence, a conclusion formed that could not be reduced to data. They were never the threat, Arbitrator Prime said quietly. A pause. They were the missing variable. The test region stabilized. Not perfectly, but naturally. And across the galaxy, something unprecedented happened. The Concordium did not reassert control. It stepped back. Fully, the galaxy held its breath. Because for the first time, it was truly free. And then, the realization spread. Humanity had not broken the galaxy. It had changed it. Not with war, not with force, but with something far more dangerous. Choice. And in that moment, from the smallest world to the oldest civilization, the same thought echoed across existence. A quiet, unshakable fear, not of destruction, but of possibility. Because if humanity could do this, if a species once dismissed as primitive, could reshape the very foundation of the galaxy, then what would happen next? The answer didn't come, because it didn't exist yet. And that was the most terrifying part of all. For the first time, the entire galaxy stood still. Not in peace, not in control, but in awe of what humanity had just begun.